Young leaders from more than 190 countries are gathered at this year's One Young World Summit, all in the name of accelerating social impact. The summit, held in Belfast, is taking place from today till Thursday, and high on the agenda is climate change and sustainability. The youth delegates will get to hear different perspectives from various political, business and humanitarian leaders on how to make a difference in the world. And one of the distinguished panelists at the One Young World Summit is a top critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin. He's been called Mr. Putin's public enemy #1 and was also on Russia's most wanted list. And here's one reason why. A major tool that Western nations have used to impose sanctions on Russia is called the Magnitsky Act. And the man responsible for the creation of this act is Bill Browder, also the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. And he joins us today from Belfast, Ireland. Warm welcome, Bill. Now, you have such an extraordinary story, and just a little bit of background about you. You were the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, but things changed in 2009 when your lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was murdered in a Moscow prison after uncovering some $230 million fraud committed by Russian government officials. And you've since sort of made it your mission to expose Russia's endemic corruption and all the human rights abuses. So, Bill, help us understand this. I mean, despite the war that's, ongoing right now and all the wide-ranging sanctions, including the Magnitsky Act that you fought so tirelessly to get enacted around the world, why does Russia's economy still seem so resilient when you have previously said that it's costing Moscow $1 billion a day to fight this war in Ukraine?
Well, I wouldn't say the economy is resilient at all. I think that this is misinformation and lies that come from the Russian government. And if they lie about everything else, why would they not lie about their economic statistics? I mean, just yesterday it was revealed that the gas exports from Russia, which is their main export, is down to levels that haven't been seen since the Soviet times. We see that central bank reserves, $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves, are frozen. All the oligarch money is frozen. And so the economy is not doing very well. The one thing that I can say, though, is that to the extent that the economy is not truly collapsing, is because they've moved to effectively a wartime economy. So economic activity is now devoted towards building tanks and artillery and so on and so forth to kill Ukrainians. And that's where the money is being spent, and that's where the economic output is coming from. But everything basically is going into this war now, and it's really a tragedy for the Russian people who shouldn't be at war in the first place. And so they're suffering. The Ukrainians are suffering dramatically, and this is all coming down to the actions and thoughts of one man, Vladimir Putin.
But you'd say that dark money is still flowing, originating from Russia, and it's still, flowing out of the country. Because I'm wondering, in terms of, tracing and tracking the flow of money that's coming out there and where it ultimately ends up, what are some of the methods and tools?
Well, so after Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer, was killed for uncovering a $230 million corruption scheme, we said, where did the $230 million go? Because we want to make sure those people don't get to enjoy it. And we were able to trace the money, and the money went all over the world. It went to 26 countries. In the end, I would say most of the money went either for luxury goods, real estate, and other yachts, private jets in places like France, Italy, Spain, the United Kingdom, United States, or some of the money went for things like purchasing chemical weapons in Syria. And so you have this sort of mixture of menace and pleasure. The oligarchs like to use the money for all these pleasurable things, and Putin, of course, likes to use the money to advance his malign influence around the world.
Now, let's talk about some of the Russian supporters here. I mean, China being one of them. Just to touch base on a new report, new analysis is showing that China is increasingly bolstering Russia's economy and its military capabilities. What is your take on Beijing's growing role here and also its trade flows with Moscow?
Well, I think that China is trying to walk a tightrope. On one hand, the Chinese economy is sort of looking vulnerable right now. And so the last thing China wants to do is enrage the West. They don't want people looking at their labels and saying, I don't want to buy Chinese because they're supporting the war in Ukraine. On the other hand, of course, China, China is a dictatorship, an authoritarian regime. They want to basically snub their nose at the democracies of the world and say, particularly the United States, and say, look, our totalitarianism works better than your democracy. And so China would like to support Russia in this war, and they do so in certain ways. They support them at the UN. China buys oil from Russia. But China, on the other side, doesn't want to enrage the West and pay the price for their own economy. And so we don't see massive amounts of Chinese weapons going to Russia because China doesn't want to be put on the sanctions list. And so they're not a true ally to Russia. They're sort of walking a tightrope, and so far they haven't gone too far in the direction of helping Russia, because if they did, there would be great costs to be paid by the Chinese economy.
So what about other nations like Hungary and South Africa? And, I'm just wondering what you think are some of the approaches that you believe US, EU, and all their allies should adopt when it comes to, these countries which have shown support for Russia in various ways.
Well, South Africa is really an interesting case. So South Africa is a country where only 0.5% of their trade is with Russia, and about 40% of their trade is with the United States, the EU, and all the other allies in this fight against Russia, helping Ukraine fight against Russia. And it doesn't really make sense why, in South Africa's case, why they would have joint naval exercises with the Russians, why they would basically take the Russians' side in this war. It certainly doesn't make economic sense. And generally, if something doesn't make sense on the surface, you have to say, well, you just don't have all the information. And so I would speculate that the reason why South Africa is doing this is not because it's in the national interests of South Africa, but probably, in my opinion, there is outright corruption going on, that Russia has paid certain politicians in South Africa to support them. And I would imagine that the same thing is true in Hungary, for example. This is not, Russia survives off of corruption, and they're very good at it, and they find people who are amenable to it. And you can find all sorts of politicians in different countries around the world who are taking Russian money, and that's how they get their support. It's not because they're buying the hearts and minds of people. It's not because it's in people's economic self-interest to carry on with Russia. It's because of corruption, plain and simple.
And we have seen footage, when Donald Trump was, the U.S. president. There were occasions when he was quite chummy with, Vladimir Putin. And with the U.S. election on the horizon, what's going to happen if, somebody or a Republican like Donald Trump wins again? How do you think that's going to impact the war if it's still ongoing by then?
Well, so Putin is not winning the war. He's probably on the margin losing the war. He's losing the war because the Ukrainians are getting Western equipment from the United States and EU military equipment, but he continues to throw more and more men into battle to die, and Putin's big bet is that he doesn't have to win the war; he just has to outlast the patience of the West. And the best opportunity he has is that if Donald Trump gets elected in November 2024, he's said that he's going to stop supplying military aid to Ukraine. And of course, we've seen signs of that in Congress right now. And if that were to happen, then the Ukrainians would eventually lose the war, and then Putin would have Ukraine, and he would then move on to other countries in Eastern Europe, principally the Baltics or Poland. And then we're in a much more unbelievably dangerous situation where America has to make a decision about whether to go to war directly with Russia because of its NATO obligations. And then you have the potential for either world war or alternatively, the destruction of NATO, which would also lead to world war eventually, with Russia taking over various countries in that part of the world. So Putin is waiting it out, hoping that the financial and military support for Ukraine collapses with the presidential election in November 2024.
So those are the various scenarios that you've painted out for us. But just before I let you go, Bill, just a personal question. You know, we all know what happened to ex-Wagner chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and you are still probably on Putin's wanted list. I'm just wondering, are you always, watching over your shoulders? I mean, do you sleep well at night?
Well, I've been at this for almost 14 years, and I've gotten survived 14 years. So I intend to survive many more years. It does require major changes of behavior, new protocols, all sorts of security arrangements. But in the end, I'm not backing down, and I will carry on fighting for justice for victims of Putin's oppression as long as I can, and I'm not going to let their threats derail me.
Right. I'm also going to be grabbing two of the books that you've written, Red Notice and Freezing Order. Well, thanks so very much for joining us today, Bill Browder, founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management.